All right, we've got a really interesting case to dig into today. It's the murder of Brian Barrett, but it's also a story about this kind of crazy love triangle that started way back in the early days of the internet. So much deception, so much danger.
Yeah, and what's fascinating is that this whole thing plays out on Pogo.com, a website that a lot of people might not even remember. Like back then, people were, they were forming real relationships in those online gaming chat rooms without ever, actually meeting face to face.
It sounds, well, almost innocent in a way, but obviously this case is anything but. It's kind of like a, cautionary tale about how quickly those online connections can turn dark.
Definitely, yeah. So this story started back in 2005 with a Pogo user named Marine Sniper. He meets tall, hot blonde, who's supposedly an 18-year-old girl, goes by the name Jessie, but neither of them are who they say they are.
Okay, so let's break this down a little bit. Who are these people behind the screen names?
All right, so Marine Sniper was actually a 46-year-old man named Tom Montgomery. He was struggling with some personal issues and kind of looking for, some kind of connection online. And when Jesse starts asking about his age, he kind of freaks out and starts spinning this web of lies, claims he's 18 and says he's using his father's account. And that's how this whole persona of Tommy is born. Tommy is this troubled young guy about to join the Marines.
Wow, and Jessie was actually buying it.
It seems like it, yeah. She was sending him photos, even some in a bikini, and pouring her heart out to this fictional character. Really shows you how the internet can become this breeding ground for fantasy.
Yeah, it's like a shared delusion, almost, both of them trying to escape their own realities. But you mentioned that there's another layer to this. What's the story with Jessie?
Well, Jessie was actually, she was a 45-year-old housewife named Mary Schuyler. And get this, she was pretending to be her teenage daughter. She was using, actual photos of her own daughter to fuel this whole online romance. She was even engaging in, cyber sex with Montgomery.
So two people, both deeply unhappy in their real lives, create these elaborate fictional identities.
Yeah.
And they get tangled up in this dangerous fantasy world online.
Exactly. It kind of speaks to, that universal human need for connection, but it also shows how that need can be twisted and exploited in the online world, especially, back then when people were maybe a little less aware of the dangers. And it really makes you wonder, what were they hoping to gain from this whole charade?
I'm particularly curious about Schuyler's motivations. Why pretend to be your own daughter? And, why get involved with this man knowing that he's lying about who he is?
She said it was to protect other girls from Montgomery. But her actions, sending him those photos, those suggestive pictures, it kind of paints a much more complicated picture. There had to be something more going on there, right? Some deeper psychological drive.
It reminds me of that term you mentioned earlier, cyber homicide. Can you maybe explain what that means and how it might apply to this case?
Sure. So the term was coined by psychologist Rex Beber, and it's a complex concept. Essentially, he argues that these virtual relationships can feel just as real as physical ones, and when they're broken, when they're shattered, the emotional fallout can be just as devastating. It can even lead to violence.
So you're suggesting that by revealing Montgomery's deception and breaking that fantasy, that Schuyler might have unintentionally contributed to the violence that followed?
That's a tough one. It's hard to say. I think we need to dig a little deeper into the specifics of what happened next to see how this online drama spilled over into the real world and how that led to those tragic consequences.
Yeah. It's already clear that this is way more than a simple case of catfishing. It's there's so many layers of deception here and such complex motives. It's scary how quickly things escalated.
Yeah, it really is. And it's a good reminder that, we got to be careful about the power we give to the people we connect with online. We project our desires, our vulnerabilities onto those online personas. And sometimes the lines between what's real and what's fantasy, they get really blurry, and sometimes the consequences can be they can be devastating.
So we left off talking about cyber homicide and how Schuyler's actions might have, unintentionally made things worse, led to the violence that happened. So what happened next in this messed up story?
Well, Montgomery's wife, Cindy, she eventually finds out about Tommy, about his whole online persona. She confronts him about it, and then she sends a letter to Jessie, along with a family photo. It's like, boom, the whole charade's exposed. You'd think that would be the end of it. Right?
You would think so. You'd think that kind of reality check would, make people stop and think.
Mm.
But that's not what happened here.
Not even close. Instead of, cutting off contact, Mary Schuyler, she like digs in deeper, keeps talking to Montgomery, even though she knows he's been lying about who he is.
Whoa. That's a risky move. It's like she's like playing with fire. Why would she do that?
She said she wanted to like keep an eye on him, to protect other girls, but it's a decision that it makes you question her judgment, and her own motives and all of this.
And this is where Brian Barrett comes into the picture, right? Montgomery's coworker.
Mm.
How does he get tangled up in this whole online love triangle thing?
So Brian becomes friends with Jesse online. He doesn't know he's actually talking to Mary Schuyler. And then, well, maybe he was being too trusting, but he tells his coworkers about Montgomery's catfishing.
So all those lies that Montgomery was so carefully, creating, they're all out in the open now. How does he take that?
Not well. He's furious. Montgomery sees Brian as like a rival, like an obstacle between him and Jesse. He starts getting jealous, starts making threats against Brian and Schuyler. It's like his obsession with this online fantasy world. It's spiraling out of control.
Wow. So we've got obsession, jealousy, deceit. It feels like things are about to explode. What happens next?
Sadly, you're right. On September 15th, 2006, Brian Barrett is shot and killed right as he's leaving work. It was like a sniper attack, 3 shots right through the driver's side window of his truck.
This just took a really dark turn. It sounds like Montgomery followed through on those threats, took his anger out on Brian. But what about Mary Schuyler? What was her role in this whole tragedy?
Well, the police, they suspected Montgomery right away. His coworkers had reported the threats, and there was evidence that pointed to him. But then during the investigation, they found out about Mary Schuyler's deception, the whole thing. Remember, they were worried about Jesse's safety, so they went to check on her using information from Brian's phone records.
And that's when they realized that Jesse didn't exist.
Exactly. They knock on the door, and who opens it? A middle-aged woman. She says she's Mary Schuyler. It's this huge revelation, like the whole online world they were living in. It all just unravels.
So now she's exposed, as the one behind this whole catfishing scheme, using her own daughter's photos to create this fake persona. What happened to her?
Well, what she did was, I mean, it was wrong, but she didn't actually break any laws, so she wasn't charged with anything. But her life, I mean, it fell apart. Her marriage ended, her daughter stopped talking to her, and she was just, under this intense public scrutiny. It's like a reminder that things you do online can have really serious real-world consequences.
Yeah. But what about Montgomery? Did he face justice for killing Brian?
He did, yeah. They arrested him, charged him. He said he was innocent at first, but then he changed his plea to guilty of first-degree manslaughter so he wouldn't have to go to trial. He ended up getting 20 years in prison.
20 years?
Yeah.
For a crime that was all because of this relationship that only existed online.
Yeah.
It really shows that the internet isn't this separate place where there are no consequences.
Exactly. And it raises so many questions, like how much are we responsible for the fantasies we create online? How do we protect ourselves and others from these kinds of dangers? And what about the ethics of building relationships that are based on lies?
These are some tough questions, but we've got to think about them, especially with how much our lives are online now. But before we get into the ethical stuff, maybe we should look more at the psychology here. So we've talked about what happened and how it all ended, but I think it's time to really try to understand the psychology behind it all. What was it about Tom Montgomery and Mary Schuyler that led them to create these fake online personas and get involved in something so destructive?
Yeah, that's the big question, isn't it? I mean, we know Montgomery wasn't happy in his marriage and he was looking for connection, but was he really delusional enough to actually believe in this fantasy world he created?
It's hard to wrap your head around, okay, creating a fake profile, that's one thing, but to actually believe you're this, young troubled Marine named Tommy, that suggests a real disconnect from reality.
And there's evidence that supports that. Remember that note they found in Montgomery's toolbox? The one where he talks about Tom Montgomery ceasing to exist and being replaced by this 18-year-old Tommy character. It's like he wanted to escape his real life, become someone else entirely.
Like he was trying to will himself into a new identity, shedding all the baggage of his real life, all the disappointments. But what about Schuyler? Why would she pretend to be her daughter and play along with this whole thing?
That's where it gets even more complicated. She said she wanted to protect other girls, but But her actions don't really match up with that, do they? I mean, sending those suggestive pictures of her daughter engaging in cybersex, even agreeing to marry him, it's all pretty messed up.
Earlier, we talked about, the idea of cyber homicide. Do you think that could help explain what happened here?
It's an interesting theory. You know, when Bieber says that virtual relationships can feel as real as physical ones, I think he's onto something, especially in this case. When Montgomery's online world came crashing down, he must have felt this huge sense of loss, like a betrayal. And it's possible that that, combined with Schuyler's manipulation, pushed him over the edge.
So you're saying that by playing along with his fantasy and then pulling away, Schuyler might have, without meaning to, contributed to the escalation that led to Brian's death.
It's important to remember that ultimately Montgomery is responsible for his actions, but we can't ignore the role that Schuyler's deception played in creating this whole dangerous situation.
This whole case is just a really powerful reminder that the internet isn't some separate world.
Right.
What we do online, it has real consequences, and sometimes those consequences are really serious.
No question. It's a warning about how dangerous online deception can be and how easy it is to blur the lines between, what's real and what's fantasy. It's a story that should make anyone think twice before creating a fake identity or doing something risky online.
It makes you think about your own online life.
Yeah.
Like how do we make sure we're being responsible, that we're protecting ourselves and others?
It starts with being aware. We have to be more critical of the information we see online, the things we share, especially when it comes to relationships. And we have to set boundaries for ourselves and the people we interact with. Things can get out of hand really quickly.
It's also about being honest, right? Like all the secrets and lies in this case, that's what created this toxic environment, both online and offline.
Exactly. This whole tragedy shows how important it is to create healthy online spaces. We have to be careful about what we do, prioritize safety, and remember that the people we connect with online, they're real people with real lives and feelings just like us.
Well, this has been a pretty intense deep dive, to say the least. What are some of the key takeaways you hope people will think about?
I think the biggest takeaway is that the internet is not a consequence-free zone. What we do and say online, it can have a huge impact on ourselves and on other people. And this case is it's a tragic example of that, how online deception and fantasy can turn into real-world violence.
It's a good reminder to be cautious, to be aware, and to be responsible when we're online. The choices we make, they matter.
And remember, building real connections based on trust and honesty, that's what's important, whether it's online or offline. We need to create online spaces where people can interact in a positive way, where they can build genuine relationships.
This case definitely gives us a lot to think about. The lines between our digital lives and our real lives are getting blurrier all the time, and we all have a responsibility to navigate that in a responsible and ethical way.
Well said. As we wrap up this deep dive, remember, even in the darkest stories, there are always lessons to be learned. By understanding what led to this tragedy, we can work towards creating a safer, more honest, and ultimately more fulfilling online experience for everyone.
Until next time, keep exploring, keep asking questions, and keep diving deep.